My free history. We have heard about what kind of fighters the Janissaries were, but this poses the question what they did whenever there was peace. As it turns out, there was a lot to do. The first task was quite common. A soldier who was not on campaign was occupied with garrison duties. Nearly every big city had a garrison of Janissaries. Local circumstances and the exigencies of warfare also influenced the size of the Janissary contingents on garrison duty. Typically, as the Ottomans consolidated the rule and governors of newly established provinces managed to man the fortresses with local troops, Istanbul was able to considerably reduce the size of Janissary garrisons. The logic behind manning the borders and important locations is clear. The troops stationed there should provide a tripwire for any attempt of invasion. But this was not the Sultan's only reasoning behind the decision to send Janissaries to garrison important locations. The Janissaries usually took over citadels, while Atzabs occupied the town beneath. By then, much of the Janissary Ochak was spread across the empire in garrison ortas, which normally did 9-month tours of duty before returning to the capital. The Janissaries were not under the command of the local governor, but instead could surveil him and stop him from rebelling. The division most important for garrison duty was the Zemat. Goodwin tells us about the usual strength of a garrison. A 15th century frontier garrison might consist of 50 Janissaries and some 30 other troops or auxiliaries. But these numbers clearly varied, and by the 17th century, garrisons were often only half strength. But as the core grew, the majority of its ortas became permanently based in the provinces under the command of local governors. They developed local interests, local loyalties, sometimes taking over local administration, and eventually they became a source of unrest themselves. The best example are the troops stationed in Syria and Algiers. In places like Iraq and Syria, the Janissaries became a local elite, rivaling other Janissary troops sent there to enforce the Sultan's interests and making other problems. In Algiers, for example, some Janissaries became corsairs like Hayreddin Barbarossa, who was the son of a Janissary stationed there. Let us look at a chart which tells us the number of Janissaries used for garrison duty. Unfortunately, we only have data for the second half of the 17th century. We see that in this period there were around 50,000 Janissaries, although the numbers dipped toward 40,000 at the end of the century. Through wild speculation we can guess the reason behind this. With the siege of Vienna in 1683 the Great Turkish War started, which certainly demanded its toll on the Janissaries. Next, let us look at the Janissaries in Istanbul. Their numbers were much more volatile. The decline between 1670 and 1692 is nearly the same as the total number, which tells us that the losses mostly came from the Janissaries stationed in Istanbul, which is not a big surprise, since they were the majority and provided the campaigning force. Last, here are the numbers of the Janissaries stationed in force. With more than 58% of all Janissaries, the year 1665 has the highest number of troops in garrison. In 1670 this number was below 27%. We probably can assume that how many Janissaries were used as garrison troops depended on their mobilization for campaigns. So, now that we know about the numbers, let us find out which tasks the Janissaries had to take on as garrisons in peacetime. The best case to study is Istanbul. The Janissaries were not only the thin red line which kept the enemy from breaking through to the Sultan, but also the thin blue line that prevented the empire from descending into this terrible thing called anarchy. Or in other words, they acted as police. The Janissaries' public order duties eventually became more important than their military role. The Janissary Agassi was, for example, also chief of police of the capital. His own Janissaries patrolled Istanbul and Galata, and Bostanchis policed the surrounding areas. If these units went on campaign, their Cemi Oklan Orta or training battalions sometimes took over policing. Goodwin gives us more background on the Bostanchis. The ranks of the 4,000 Bostanchis were filled by Ajami Oglans, including in some instances boys straight from the levy. The Bostanchis also performed police duties in the suburbs and the forest around Istanbul and along the shores of the waterways. They only went to war when the Sultan himself took the field. The Bostanchis mostly had to control the area outside of Istanbul as well as everything that had to do with the Sultan. Actually, the Bostanchis are a complicated case. Sometimes they counted as Janissaries, sometimes not. Personally, I include them because they also drew recruits through Devshirme, although mostly Bosnian Muslims. Anyway, the task of keeping order in the city itself fell to the 56th Order, which was stationed permanently as police around the Golden Horn. The Janissaries did not only wait in the barracks for a crime to be reported. There were police stations manned by Janissaries in all the major gates of the walled city, as well as in other major points throughout Istanbul and its 3 boroughs. Unlike modern police forces, the Janissaries had functions which were more comprehensive than just fighting the crime. Supervision of market was among the myriad police duties performed by Janissaries. Even the market inspectors employed by the chief of Istanbul were Janissaries from the 56th Aga Bölük Regiment. But how did the ordinary citizens take to this police force composed of Janissaries? How did their responsibility of supervising the markets turn out? Goodwin describes the behavior of the police force in the chaotic aftermath of the death of Selim III in 1808. The barracks had become the refuge of those who had neither hearth nor job and who hated work. Disorder and vice reigned there. Those Janissaries who were assigned police duties ignored public security and held the neighborhood to ransom. The senior officers were in league with usurers. However much some citizens might hate them and dread the bullying and thieving, the Janissaries did maintain order in the city. Order they did maintain as long as this was to their benefit. It seems like the thin blue line made up by Janissaries was more like a thick rope around honest people's necks. Not only in war did the Janissaries play with fire, they also had to face the more than common fires in Istanbul. This seems to have been in close connection with the tasks as policemen. In addition to their police duties, one of the Janissaries' most important tasks was firefighting, for which they were specially trained and equipped with various appliances. The Grand Vizier and the Aga of the Janissaries were in duty bound to oversee the firefighters, and the Sultan himself assisted in person if the conflagration proved to be of importance. How would the Janissaries notice such a fire? Of course, citizens or Janissary police patrols might notice fires and raise the alarm. But aside from that, there were 2 towers in Istanbul which were used to watch for fires. Both of them are still standing tall. One is the Gull Tower. It is 67 meters high and was built in 1348 when Constantinople was still the center of the Byzantine Empire. The other one is the Bayezid Tower at Bayezid Meydan, close to the Eski Saray. It is 85 meters high and was built in 1749. So whenever a fire broke out, the watchers would spot it, beat the drum and rush to extinguish the flames. Or would they? Fires were used by the Janissaries as political weapons. Thus, in 1554, when on campaign in Asia and in the quarters, the Janissaries manifested the hatred for Rustam Pasha by setting the innocent town alight and prevented anyone from extinguishing the flames. An easy method of embarrassing any Grand Vizier or Janissary Aga was to start a fire, and this device was resorted to many times, and was one of the favorite Janissary tricks to arouse confusion from which they hoped to benefit. There are a lot of anecdotes about the Janissaries playing with fire. Here are only some of them. 1569, when the Great Fire in the Jewish quarter of Istanbul burned for a day and a night, the redoubtable Sokullu Mehmed Pasha had the greatest difficulty in fighting the flames because the Janissaries Aga was ill and no one else had the strength of will to make them work or stop looting the houses in the path of the conflagration. But arson did not only serve as a political tool, there were pragmatic considerations behind it too. Devil was watching a fire in Istanbul when he saw a Janissary fireman, grimy with sweat, in charge of 2 small fire wagons, accost an Armenian whose house stood in the path of the fire and who was trying to remove his furniture. The Janissary demanded 10,000 piastres in return for saving the Armenian's house. The Armenian could not pay up, but the Jew could, and so the Janissaries went to action. They tore down intervening houses with picks and axes and thus managed to divert the conflagration and to save the houses they had contracted to do. We learn from this story that you should better pay up. Otherwise, the Janissaries might not only let your house burn down, but maybe even tear it down in order to save another house. For the Janissaries, it made a little difference. They would get your money anyway. The famous fires of Istanbul, which occasionally ravaged the city, also contributed to vast employment opportunities. The majority of the Janissary pay ticket owners who were employed in the construction trade were construction tools producers. The rest were craftsmen who specialized in building services, namely house painters, plasterers, carpenters, stonemasons and plumbers. So, when setting the price for extinguishing a fire, the Janissaries were probably weighing the sum they would receive for extinguishing a fire, or at least save the property of the victims, against having to earn the money through rebuilding the burnt down buildings. Therefore, let him who desires peace prepare for war. These are the well-known words of Vegetius. Although I doubt that an ordinary Janissary knew about him, they followed his suggestion. Preparation for war is mainly concerned with logistics. This is a more general topic and not only applicable to the Janissaries, but since it is a favorite topic of all history YouTubers, we'll talk about it anyway. The Ottoman Empire's system of planning and preparation was extensive. Campaigns were planned well ahead in October and November, with actual operations normally taking place in August and September of the following year. Military leaders consulted old soldiers and the records of previous operations. Huge quantities of stores were sent ahead before or during mobilization. This also meant that the Janissaries usually had plenty of fresh food like bread, onions, mutton, dried beef and pilaf. If those stores were not enough, they still could dip into the reserve of hard-baked biscuits, the peksimet. During mobilization, the troops of provincial rulers supplemented the Sultan's personal soldiers. There were a lot of bigger cities serving as gathering points. Of course, Istanbul was one of them. There were gathering centers on both sides of the Bosphorus. Which city would be the gathering point depended on the geographic direction of the coming campaign. Skopje and Thessaloniki served as launching pads for campaigns in Albania and Greece respectively. War in Hungary could be supplied through Belgrade. Starting points for fighting in Wallachia, Transylvania, Moldavia, as well as the Ukraine and Russia were the cities of Rus, Brela, Dulcia and Iasi. In the south, the gathering centers for campaigns in Iraq or Persia were Erzurum and Van, Diyarbakir and Mosul respectively. Elaborate preparations were made at the start of each campaign, and either the Sultan's 6-horsetail banner or the Vezir's 3-horsetail banner would be erected in the first courtyard of the Topkapi Palace before being sent ahead to warn of the army's approach. Roads and bridges were repaired along the line of march, with prefabricated pontoon bridge being floated across large rivers. Cairns of stones would be piled up to indicate the way if there were no roads. Masters of artisans and other personal tasks with questions of supplying the soldiers accompanied the army. A recruit could easily find himself in one of these support units after the first years of his training. On the march, the army would follow along the road as follows. In the 18th century, with a little bit of luck, the street would be a paved strip. This would be used by pedestrians and 4-wheeled wagons, which the Ottomans utilized a lot. On the side of the paved part, the streets consisted of cleared and beaten strips of earth. There rode the horsemen. Let us look at this in a diagram. As we just heard, a good Ottoman street should have a paved strip in the middle. On both sides there were cleared strips of earth. While the foot soldiers and carts would use the paved way, the riders were restricted to the sides. All in all, the Ottoman roads were highly influenced by the Romans, which was no wonder since they took over the infrastructure of the Byzantine Empire. The streets connected the mobilization centers. An example of this is the old Via Militaris. It connected many cities. For the Ottomans, the route from Istanbul to Belgrade was the most important part of the street. It ran through the cities of Lüleburgaz, Edirne, Plovdiv, Sofia, Nice, Kostolac and Belgrade. This probably is a good place to take a look at what we learned today. During peacetime, the Janissaries garrisoned strategic cities and fortresses not only to defend the empire, but also in order to keep the local commanders under control. When an occupied area was pacified, the Janissary garrison usually grew smaller. This proved to have unintended consequences, since especially in Syria and North Africa, the Janissary orders stationed there became more and more independent. The other important peacetime tasks could be found mainly in Istanbul. There the Janissaries served as a police force. In the coastal regions and in the suburbs of Istanbul, as well as in the imperial palaces, the Bostanchis fulfilled this task. Over the city, Kolluk's police stations were spread, which were manned by the 56th Order, a Janissary regiment stationed in Istanbul permanently. These soldiers did not only patrol the city, but also oversee the markets, which inevitably led to a lot of corruption. The other task of the Janissaries in Istanbul was that of a fire brigade. In order to detect fires quickly, they positioned watchers on the Gull Tower and the Bayezid Tower. In case of serious fires, the Grand Vizier, the Yaga of the Janissaries, and sometimes even the Sultan at least pretended to participate in the extinguishing of the inferno. Like in the case of the police, power corrupted the Janissaries soon enough. They would only save houses whose owner would bribe them. If the house burned down, this was no loss to them. The Janissaries had good connections to the guild and could earn money by rebuilding the city. The last of the Janissaries' peace duties was to prepare for war. They planned ahead for the campaigns of the following years and prepared food stocks. For the actual campaign, household and provincial troops would gather in mobilization centers, which were spread all over the empire. And now it's your turn again. Over time, the Janissaries became more and more corrupted and ignored their duties as fire and policemen. Which reforms would you recommend to get this problem under control? So long, we'll meet again in 2 weeks. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free.